This video will take a look at Poppies by Susan Weir and Remains by Simon Armitage, and then pull them together into a comparison. We'll start with Poppies, but we'll look at some themes which you might be able to apply to both poems. The effects of conflict is a particularly relevant theme because both of these poems deal with the aftermath of conflict and what conflict does to individuals. The effect of conflict on identity, the way these individuals feel, and how it affects their sense of self. Therefore, individual experiences of conflict and also memory. Both poems are very much about trying to remember or trying to forget. We'll start with Poppies by Susan Weir, and as with all these poems, I'll start with narrative voice. This is a first person narrator, as is Remains. That's one thing they both have in common. In this case, it's the mother of a soldier. So it is a poem which gives us the female experience of conflict, not of actually fighting, but of the effects on the female identity of conflict. It is written in the past tense. It's a poem which is recalling memories. And as with all first-person narrations, we must consider it to be in some way unreliable. Yes, it is recounting personal experiences, which might make it more reliable, but those personal experiences are loaded with emotion, and emotion often makes narration unreliable. Let's start with stanza 1 then, and it begins like this. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. So this is a reflection, and the mother is recalling an act of tenderness. Her son is before her. We can presume that he's in his military uniform. It seems to me that he's in some sort of uniform, and she's pinning a poppy onto his lapel. We start with poppies had already been placed. There seems to be an acceptance here. This is a poem about the inevitability of loss and the loss of a number of things, the loss of a son, who's gone off to fight. It's never clear whether the son has died in conflict. Actually, that's never made explicitly clear, but either died in conflict or is gone off to fight somewhere else. So she's lost him either way, and also the loss of her role as a mother. But there's something of an inevitability about that at the start of this poem. On individual war graves, this is a personal experience and a personal reflection. Spasms of paper red, very interesting way to describe the poppy. The poppy, which is an act of remembrance in itself and therefore an act of love in itself. The use of anastrophe is interesting here, of paper red, anastrophe where the words are not in the same order that we might expect them. It should be spasms of red paper. That seems to be a disruption of order and a disruption of the mother's life or identity. Conflict has disrupted her life in some way, so that seems to be appropriate. The poppy also seems to be painful, spasms of paper red. This is a symbol of remembrance and tenderness. Spasms is an interesting way to describe it. And again, I think that these moments of reflection and remembrance and love are now causing the mother pain, and we'll see that increasingly. She describes a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Well, first of all, we've got the semantic field of warfare here with blockade, but also we've got the plosive consonants and alliteration, the B sound, perhaps reflecting the harsh callousness of conflict, which is intertwined with the compassion of motherhood. And throughout this poem, we see acts of love which are being infiltrated, if you like, by thoughts of violence and conflict. The effects of war are taking over her acts of tenderness as a mother and causing her pain. And we get a similar idea when we move on to stanza 2. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled blackthorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt. Again, we get words in the semantic field of injury or conflict here. We've got bandaged, sellotape bandaged around my hand, steeled the softening, and graze my nose. Acts of motherly tenderness are now causing the mother pain because they cause her to reflect on the fact that she has lost her son, and she has also lost her identity and her role as a mother. And that becomes, the reason for that becomes clear when she says she resisted the impulse to run her fingers through the gelled blackthorns of his hair. This seems to me quite clearly to be a religious reference to Christ and the crown of thorns. Her son is therefore a symbol of sacrifice, and it is the recognition of the sacrifice that he has made that makes her understand the sacrifice that she also has made as a mother, and it is that that causes her pain. Her identity is shifted in some way. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt. And this is the start of the narrative voice beginning to use words in the semantic field of embroidery. We get it increasingly in stanza 3. And it seems to me this is a woman who is clinging to the domestic role. She's clinging on to the role of a mother in order to reinforce her identity. That is what she knows. That is what she desires. Felt is an interesting one here because yes, it's associated with embroidery, but it's also associated with the army uniform, particularly in the form of the beret. And so we get the conflict of two worlds here. We get the world of the mother intertwined and conflicting with the world of the army and the world of conflict. And that really is the crux of this poem. These two worlds are colliding, and the mother no longer knows where she stands. She no longer has a fixed role as mother. It also causes her pain because she has to acknowledge the loss of her son. So when we move on to stanza 3, slowly melting, I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you had gone, I went to your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me, skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless without a winter coat or reinforcement of scarf, gloves. This is where we see that part of the pain the mother has been caused is through the inevitability of releasing her son out into the world, released a songbird from its cage. It's quite an obvious, almost clunky metaphor, but it does sum up this idea of the woman's acknowledgement that as a mother, she has to release her son into the world. She has to relinquish that role in some way. But it's tinged with an additional pain this time because there is the realization that he might never return. The pear tree is a really interesting symbol in this poem. She says, a single dove flew from the pear tree. The pear tree is an ancient and sacred symbol of love and separation. The pear was seen as womb-shaped. It is therefore a symbol of femininity, but also of separation because of the realization that the womb must be separated from the body in order to give birth. It's also associated with Hera, the Greek goddess of marriage and childbirth. So this is a symbol which cements the mother to her role as mother and as woman. But also it is a recognition of separation too. So we get that conflict between love and separation and the pain that brings her. And it is war and conflict which has caused that separation from who she used to be. And then again, we get the words in the semantic field of embroidery, as if this is a woman desperately clinging to her role as mother, because that is what she understands, that is what defines her, and that is being taken away from her. And as a result of that, she is clearly left exposed and vulnerable. Her identity is changed by conflict without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. And then we move on to the final stanza. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscription on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. One of the most interesting lines in the poem for me is this one where she leaned against the war memorial like a wishbone. It seems she's seeking support. She is a woman who is conflicted and who is being weakened by her role as mother being taken away from her. But also that she seems to have a divided identity between motherhood and warfare. She is both equally now. We can see that image of her leaning against the war memorial, her on one side, the war memorial on the other. She is being almost torn in two by war and conflict here. The dove pulled freely. Well, pulled freely is almost a paradoxical phrase, kind of summing up the conflict of identity that this mother is experiencing. On the one hand, desperately clinging to the maternal role, but on the other, acknowledging that she has to let her son go. So we move on to Remains now, and we'll consider the title first of all, because it has some significance. We might consider remains to be human remains, dead bodies, therefore the reality of conflict, and we certainly see evidence of that in the poem. But we also get the remains of identity, a psychological remains, if you like, the aftermath and after effects of conflict. This is very much a poem which deals with the action and reality of conflict, but that reality also is the aftermath, what's left after the soldiers have returned, and it's not their full being. So what remains is what conflict has taken away. The narrative voice here then, this is another first person narrative. It's another personal reflection on an event or a series of events. And it's from the perspective of a real person, Guardsman Tromans. We know that because Simon Armitage wrote this poem as part of a collection called The Not Dead, and there's a documentary to accompany that collection. It really is worth watching. Look it up. It's called The Not Dead, and we get a section from that documentary, which is Guardsman Tromans recalling the events that Armitage writes about in the poem and telling us about his life after he got home. So it's from his perspective. He is a veteran of the Second Gulf War. The events took place sometime around 2003 or 2004, and the poem was written in 2007, while the Gulf War was still going on. It's written in a colloquial tone, kind of the everyday language of the soldier, and it is a recollection of memory. So once again, it is like Poppies in many ways. It is unreliable as a narration because it is first person, because it is loaded with emotion, but also it is loaded with the doubt that trying to recall memory inevitably creates. Stanzas 1 and 2 then. On another occasion we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear. So we start with on another occasion. The opening line reveals to us that this is part of an ongoing narrative. It seems that this kind of event is a regular occurrence, and we're therefore immediately introduced to the idea that this soldier is desensitized, or the soldiers are desensitized to the reality of conflict. As I said before, it's in colloquial language. This is part of the soldier's identity. It's the everyday occurrence of their lives. An interesting phrase which is repeated later in the poem is probably armed, possibly not. Like the mother in Poppies, we can't entirely rely on the memory because it is loaded with emotion. It seems here that the soldier is trying to detach himself, and this is one of the differences between this poem and Poppies. The soldier here is trying to distance himself from the identity that he had before as a soldier through the doubt that he creates. He's trying to distance himself from the event as well. The mother is very much trying to cement herself to the events of the past. But both of them are trying to distance themselves from the reality of conflict. The soldier does that by trying to forget his past. The mother does it by trying to remember her past. The repetition here, well, myself and somebody else, sums up that this isn't just an individual experience, it is a collective experience. But with that collective experience comes shared responsibility. And I think that's why the soldier uses this repetition, or Armitage uses this repetition, because through emphasizing shared responsibility, the soldier also confirms that this is a shared guilt. And he uses euphemistic language, all of the same mind, open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly. This is euphemistic language. It avoids the reality of what they did. And that is also part of the attempt to distance himself from the reality and therefore to soothe in some way the guilt that he's feeling. Then in stanza 3 and 4, there's an acknowledgement of what happened. I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. Well, first of all, we get the terminal caesura at the end of line 1. This seems to be a moment of reflection. And it's because he's seen broad daylight, light often a symbol of the truth. He's seen the truth of what happened. There is an acknowledgement of what they've done. And this, significantly, is the start of his decline, because this is the point where his identity changes. We get the repetition of probably armed, possibly not. There is an unreliability of memory. He's trying to detach himself from blame and guilt. And the verb choices are also interesting here. Tosses and carted. The soldiers and the victim are dehumanized, almost animalized. Their identities are reshaped by warfare, just as the mother's identity is shaped by warfare in Poppies. On to stanzas 5 and 6 then, and this is the aftermath now of what the soldier has done. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep and he's probably armed, possibly not. Dream and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. We notice first of all this line, end of story, and we would expect a full stop there, end of story, but we don't. We get end of story, except not really. And this is where it is revealed to us that what happens on the battlefield doesn't end on the battlefield. It stays with the soldier. And this is the beginning of the after effects of warfare, the way in which his identity is continually changed and reshaped as a result of what he's done. There are a series of end stops here. We get one at the end of line 1 of this stanza, of line 3, and then of the first 3 lines of stanza 6. They seem to me to be a desire for closure, but the enjambment which follows those end stops reveals to us that he cannot get closure. This closure cannot be achieved because the effects will follow him. We also get the medial caesura of then I'm home on leave, but I blink and he bursts again, and the enjambment into the next stanza reveals to us that the effect of what he has done will remain with him. And this is where the metaphor of the blood shadow comes in. He says, his blood shadow stays on the street. It's a great metaphor to really describe and emphasize the effects of conflict. The effects have become part of him and will follow him. They have redefined him. Just as in Poppies the woman is redefined by conflict, so the soldier here is redefined. The plosive consonants again, particularly with "but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank," the plosive B sound there. This is a soldier who is consumed by the violent memories of warfare. They are inescapable. And a reference to sleep and dream. His memory seems to have taken on a haunting quality now, almost a nightmarish quality. Sleeping is our way of restoring ourselves, and the fact that he can't sleep, well, he can sleep, but whenever he does, he's consumed by warfare, reveals that his identity is forever changed. He cannot be restored to what he was. The same as the mother desperately wants to be restored to the maternal role, but she can't be. Conflict won't allow it. And following on from that, flush seems to have connotations of baptism, a cleansing, but this is a soldier who cannot be cleansed of what he has done. So then on to the final stanza, but near to the knuckle here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. First of all, it's a shorter final stanza. The structure is broken down. We have 6 quatrains and then a couplet at the end. So the structure's broken down, reflective perhaps of a soldier who is seeking clarity and order, but he can't quite get that clarity and order because conflict doesn't work like that. And it doesn't work like that because conflict has changed who he is. He says, near to the knuckle and in my bloody hands. He seems to have internalized the effects of warfare. They have become part of him. It's not blood on his hands, it's blood in his hands. And blood is a recurring and increasingly inescapable symbol of guilt. And there are certainly references to Macbeth here, the aftermath of Macbeth's murder of Duncan, where he can't get the blood off his hands. It seems to be a reference to that. The guilt will remain. It has reshaped him forevermore. So let's try and draw some of that together into a comparison. Well, in Poppies, her identity is forever reshaped by the effects of warfare, and we see that with first of all the semantic field of warfare and injury, in sellotape bandaged and turned into felt, but also by the symbol of the pear tree, that symbol of love and separation. Similarly, in Remains, the experiences of warfare become part of the soldier's identity, the blood shadow and the blood on his hands. And the subtlety of the comparison is perhaps that both poems reveal that this is a reshaping of identity. It's both a personal and a collective experience. In Poppies, it's an experience of all mothers who send their sons off to war or their daughters off to war. And in Remains, it seems to be an experience for all soldiers. So although it's individually recounted, it is an experience that can be shared by others. And in both poems, it's a conflict which prevents a return to their previous selves. In Poppies, we see a desperate attempt by the mother to return to the maternal role with words in the semantic field of embroidery. And in Remains, we see a soldier who cannot be cleansed of the effects of warfare. The drink and drugs won't flush him out, and he can't be restored by dreaming or sleeping. The desire for restoration is always interrupted by warfare because the effects of conflict are ongoing, relentless, and inescapable. I hope that's been helpful as an analysis of those two poems and given you some ideas about how you might draw them together in a comparison particularly centred around identity or the effects of conflict.